My name's Alison Hawke, and this is my presentation for the module Reflection, Action, Evidence Review, which is a 5-credit module on the Level 9 Postgrad Diploma in Teaching and Learning. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through a review of my flexible pathway to the Postgrad Diploma in Teaching and Learning, and explain the impact that this process had on my teaching practice, on my teaching philosophy and values, and then wrap up with a kind of an overall headline of what I do differently now as a result of completing this programme. So this is my flexible pathway to the Postgrad Diploma in Teaching and Learning. So in 2013 I started out with a module called Certificate in Teaching and Learning, and that was my first ever proper introduction to pedagogical theory. I come across some stuff in a kind of scattered way before, like Bloom's taxonomy, but I hadn't really ever done a deep dive into the different learning theories that were out there, like behaviourism, constructivism, social constructivism. And for me, some of the really important key ideas that I took away from that course were social constructivism. So before, I had been very much a behaviourist in my approach, but I wasn't aware of that. I didn't have the vocabulary for it. And I, as a result of completing that module, moved to being a more social constructivist approach. And also the idea of the novice to expert trajectory. So I suppose the social constructivism at a very simple level is the idea that rather than knowledge and learning being something that we impart to the students like an object we give them, it's something that the student constructs for themselves based on a social experience that they have in the learning environment. And the novice to expert trajectory is the idea that experts don't always make great teachers, because when they get to a certain point on the arc or the trajectory of development, they have internalised and automatised a lot of the skills that they are then expected to teach, but they're submerged kind of because they become automatic for the expert, and then the expert finds it difficult to explain them and communicate them properly to the novice. And that sometimes people are in the middle of the journey, like peers just slightly ahead of a novice can be better teachers. And that means that introducing a lot of peer learning, peer-to-peer learning and peer assessment can have a dramatic effect on in improving students' learning experience. And I certainly found that to be a revelation. It explained a lot of the difficulties I was having in kind of getting students to grasp the types of skills I was trying to teach them. And when I introduced a lot of peer learning as a result of that module, I overcame a lot of obstacles that I had previously encountered in my teaching practice. In the certificate of in assessment and evaluation that I completed the following semester, I came across the idea of, rather than what I had been doing before, which was assessment of a certain type, because that's how assessment is always done in a law course, I came across theories of assessment and different types of assessment for different purposes, and different types of assessment for formative purposes and summative purposes, and different types of summative assessment as learning, which I'd never come across before. The idea that a summative assessment wasn't just to measure what the student had learned, that it could be a way that the students learned actually in fact itself. And also what was really an important idea for me was the idea of constructive alignment of summative assessments with the learning outcomes. So the idea that you design your assessments based on the learning outcomes, so they actually assess the learning outcomes, which seems like a really obvious and simple idea once you come across it, but I hadn't actually considered it before doing that course. And that really improved my ability to innovate in assessment. Before that, I'd been kind of hidebound by traditional approaches and not really knowing why. And because I was then given a framework through which I could analyse and break down different types of assessments, I could then innovate with my assessment types, and that's really improved my teaching. In 2014, I completed the Creating an Inclusive Curriculum module, and this was a really important point in the development of my teaching in terms of how I design my modules. So before this, I would have presented my material in the same way material was presented to me when I was in college, in the form of like typed up notes and then later PowerPoints. I didn't really think about designing the fundamentals of the curriculum in a way that made it accessible. I thought about accessibility as things like, the right coloured notes with the right font, and not in terms of curriculum design itself. And so the introduction to the Universal Design for Learning principles was a really important point in my development of my teaching practice, and the idea of the multiple means of representation, action and engagement. And that's something that I've really kind of incorporated into my assessment, particularly assessment process. The certificate in technology enhanced learning then I completed in 2015, and in that we looked at the role of technology in learning. In particular, the virtual learning environment is not just what I had seen it as, a repository for notes, like a notice board, a digital notice board, but an actual classroom, and asynchronous at times, or sometimes synchronous, but an actual tool in learning. And that was a really important development for me. I also came across the idea of the flipped classroom, which kind of totally changed my outlook on my role in the classroom. So instead of the idea that I had to be in charge and I had to be the centre of the learning experience all the time and controlling it, that the students could be in charge of their learning experience. And that was a massive turnaround for me. In implementing the UDL curriculum, in 2017, we looked at some more practicalities of UDL, Universal Design for Learning, including how to evaluate learning objects we learn in the classroom, we were using in the classroom for accessibility, and how to design learning objects that were more accessible, and the principles of instructional design for learning and things like the ADDIE cycle. Reflection, Action and Review, which we're just completing now, is a capstone module, and it enabled me to synthesize the above modules and the key learnings from them, identify them and take them forward and incorporate them into my teaching practice, and to develop more awareness and insight about my professional development. So what impact did this have on my teaching practice? So it enabled me to engage in better module design, so constructive alignment for learning, in particular, was really important in that, and also the UDL principles enabled me to drastically improve the accessibility and effectiveness of my modules and my assessment techniques. This resulted in bettering student engagement and feedback, so student satisfaction and learning improved. It improved my ongoing development, so I developed a reflective and reflexive practice. So rather than going to the teaching and learning principles when I was encountering a problem in the classroom, I would continually reflect on what worked and what didn't work and take note of that and incorporate that into the following year's delivery. It also enabled me to innovate to a much greater degree. So because I was now aware of and understood the theoretical underpinnings of what I was doing in the classroom to a much greater degree, I could break it down much more effectively and therefore break out of outmoded ways of thinking and working and innovate in a way that was structured. So the impact on my teaching philosophy and values then. So the values that I underpin my teaching haven't changed at all since I started teaching many years ago. But what's changed is the way that I express those values in my teaching. So the way that I implement those values has changed, and what those values mean in a practical sense has altered. So in terms of inclusivity, for me, inclusivity meant that I would, when a student came to me and said they were having trouble accessing the notes or the materials, I would ask them what they needed and incorporate that. And I thought I was being really super inclusive and really aware. And I would announce this at the start of every year. The students could approach me if they wanted to have more accessible materials. And I realised after doing the inclusive curriculum and UDL modules that I was forcing students to out themselves as having disabilities or other issues, and that I wasn't being inclusive. So they instead designing the materials in a way that all students could access them without having to ask for particular accommodations is a much more inclusive approach, and that's the approach that I try to take now. So fairness, I always thought fairness meant one size fits all approach. Everybody does the exact same assessment under the same conditions. And through particularly modules like the inclusive curriculum ones, I came to realise that that's not fair in all cases, because students aren't starting off in the same place. So I realised that fairness can sometimes mean giving students different ways to approach the assessment or approach the material, and that differential treatment is sometimes fairer than one-size-fits-all treatment. Ethics, so before I would have thought of ethics only in terms of referencing academic ethics, and then through the course I've come to kind of have a broader concept of that in the integrity of how I approach my teaching and learning practice and deal with my students, as well as the integrity of how the students approach their learning and dealing with their fellow students as well. Learner-centeredness for me before would have meant that I, tried to identify what the students' needs were. I would do surveys of learning styles and try and find out what disability student had, and then alter my materials to meet those needs. And I thought that I was being very learner-centred when I did that. But then I realised when I particularly did the certificate in assessment, or a certificate in technology enhanced learning, the idea of the flipped classroom, the idea that students might be key stakeholders in their learning who could maybe be the drivers of how education is conducted, rather than just passengers in the experience constructed by me. So instead I started to give students much more stake in their learning. At the start of the year, I'd allow students to choose some of the assessment methods that would be used during the course, for example, or the topics from the syllabus that we focus on based on what the students were interested in learning about, and give them kind of some degree of control over their learning experience where that was possible. And then scholarship, for me, formerly would have meant substantive subject matter scholarship, whereas now for me it's expanded to encompass scholarship in teaching and learning and in my teaching practice, as well as subject matter scholarship and expertise. So in conclusion, the postgrad diploma in teaching and learning and my flexible pathway through it has led me to develop over the last 8 years a cyclical process of professional development that has been really beneficial. So instead of, as I said before, reacting reactively to challenges that arise in the classroom and then seeking resources to address those, I now reflect on an ongoing basis on my teaching practice. Identify what works and what doesn't. Where stuff doesn't work, or problems arise, I do research and continuous professional development on that, and then come up with a solution to deal with the issue, and then implement that solution, and then reflect on that at the end of the process, how well it's worked and or whether it hasn't worked. And that for me has been really useful in terms of drastically improving my teaching practice and improving the students' experience of my teaching. And it's also meant that I've realised the benefits of reflective learning, and I've incorporated that into my courses. So nearly all of my courses have a reflective element to them now to teach that to students too. Okay, so thanks for listening. That's my flexible pathway through the postgrad diploma in teaching and learning.